The machines arrived before dawn. Front-end loaders, excavators, and lines of dump trucks moved into position at the mouth of a tunnel cut deep into the mountainside near Khomeini, a city in Iran's Markazi province. There was no secrecy in the movement, no attempt to hide the work. The crews simply began to dig. Commercial satellite imagery captured on April 10, 2026, shows Iranian engineering teams using heavy construction equipment to restore access to an underground ballistic missile base near the city of Khomeini in Markazi province, following weeks of sustained United States and Israeli airstrikes. The images are clear. The machines scoop rubble, the trucks haul it away, and somewhere beneath all of that crushed rock and collapsed concrete, Iran's buried missile launchers wait. Iran has been working to remove debris blocking the entrances to its underground missile bases during the ceasefire, according to satellite images reviewed by CNN. In the images, front-end loaders can be seen scooping up rubble from the blocked tunnels and loading it into nearby dump trucks. The same scene plays out at a second location south of Tabriz, in Iran's northwestern East Azerbaijan province. Two sites, the same machinery, the same mission. To understand what is happening at those tunnel entrances, it is necessary to understand what happened inside the conflict that put the debris there in the first place. Throughout the 5-week conflict, American and Israeli forces deliberately targeted the entrances and ventilation shafts of Iran's underground missile infrastructure, commonly known as missile cities, in a strategy aimed at trapping launchers inside rather than destroying the missiles directly. It was a calculated approach. Strike the door, not the room. Bury the weapons in place, prevent the launchers from driving out, firing, and returning to reload. The strategy had a logic rooted in the reality that the underground infrastructure itself, carved into mountains across the Iranian interior, was too hardened and too deep to destroy from the air with conventional munitions. The strikes focused on sealing access points rather than penetrating the deeper underground infrastructure, which remains intact inside the mountainous terrain. The missiles did not burn, the launchers did not break. They were simply sealed behind walls of rock and concrete rubble, waiting for whoever came with the machinery to dig them out. That machinery has now arrived. The excavation efforts are taking place during a 2-week ceasefire agreed upon by the United States and Iran on April 7, 2026. The pause in hostilities has enabled Iranian forces to deploy engineering teams and heavy equipment to affected sites without the immediate risk of additional strikes. The ceasefire, brokered through Pakistan, gave both sides time to step back from the edge of a broader catastrophe. It also gave Iran's military engineers a window to work. U.S. intelligence officials assess that Iran can recover many of the buried missile launchers relatively quickly, potentially within days rather than months, and still retains thousands of medium and short-range ballistic missiles that can be retrieved from both above-ground and underground storage facilities. That assessment reframes the picture that American officials had been presenting to the public. Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth had asserted that U.S. military actions had functionally destroyed Iran's missile program, rendering the nation combat ineffective for years to come. The satellite images taken 3 days after the ceasefire took effect told a different story. The trucks were already moving, the tunnels were already being cleared. The program that had been declared destroyed was in the process of being recovered. U.S. intelligence assessed that about half of Iran's missile launchers remained intact after a month of fighting, according to sources who spoke with CNN. Many of those launchers may now be buried underground because of the strikes on tunnel entrances. Israeli officials put the figure lower, citing differences in methodology, particularly regarding whether buried or inaccessible launchers are counted as operational assets. The gap between the American and Israeli assessments reflects something deeper than numbers. It reflects a disagreement about what the last 5 weeks of air campaign actually achieved. None of this surprised Sam Lair, a research associate at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. Lair noted that the efforts to restore access to the bases were expected, explaining that a ceasefire requires you to accept the fact that your adversary is going to rebuild some of the military capability that you just invested time, effort, and money in destroying. The machines at Khomeini were not a surprise. They were a predictable consequence of the pause. Lair added that this fits the broader concept of missile city operations, which means you absorb the first attack, dig yourself out, and then launch again. That doctrine, embedded into the construction of Iran's underground missile network over decades, had been built precisely for this moment. The missile cities were not just fortified, they were designed to survive an air campaign and come back online. The excavation crews now working at the tunnel entrances were not improvising. They were executing a plan that was written long before the first strike fell. The broader picture of Iran's missile network is one that had alarmed military planners for years before the conflict began. Facilities buried hundreds of meters underground across multiple provinces, hardened against conventional weapons, capable of storing and launching ballistic missiles of varying ranges. Iranian commanders had previously stated publicly that long-range missile sites are located 500 meters deep underground in all the provinces and cities and are ready to be launched, and that they have no concern about the most advanced satellite and spy systems of their enemies since the country's missile sites are hidden inside the mountains. Those words, spoken years before the war, had now been put to a direct test. The test was not yet finished. While the machines worked at Khomeini and Tabriz, diplomacy was grinding forward in parallel. Talks between the United States and Iran in Islamabad failed to reach a resolution over ending the war, with Vice President J.D. Vance announcing the breakdown after more than 20 hours of negotiations. The meeting was the first face-to-face negotiation between the two countries in more than a decade, and the highest-level meeting between U.S. and Iranian officials since the Islamic Republic's founding in 1979. Vice President J.D. Vance led the U.S. delegation, which also included Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, while Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchi led the Iranian delegation. The sticking point, at least from the U.S. perspective, was that Iran refused to terminate its nuclear program, relinquish the nearly 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium it had accumulated, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to all naval traffic, without the payment of tolls. The talks broke down without a deal. The ceasefire, however, held. And under the cover of that ceasefire, the trucks kept moving. U.S. officials cautioned the Wall Street Journal that Iran might be able to recover and repair a significant portion of its buried missile stockpile. The concern was not academic. Every launcher that came back online beneath a cleared tunnel entrance was a launcher that could be driven out, positioned, and fired. The geography of the conflict had not changed. The targets that those missiles could reach had not moved. Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to lead a potential second round of negotiations with Iranian officials should a meeting happen before the ceasefire expires next week. The window for diplomacy was still open, but it was narrowing. The machines at Khomeini were working against the clock just as much as the negotiators were. What the satellite images captured on April 10th was not simply a military operation. It was a statement. Iran had absorbed the largest air campaign directed at its military infrastructure in the history of the Islamic Republic. It had lost its nuclear sites to American bunker-buster bombs dropped from B-2 stealth bombers. It had watched its proxy networks absorb punishment across the region. And yet, within 3 days of a ceasefire taking effect, its engineering corps was at the tunnel entrances with front-end loaders and dump trucks, clearing the way back to its buried arsenal. The doctrine that Sam Lair described was not a theory. It was being executed in real time, photographed from orbit, and published for the world to see. Absorb the first attack, dig yourself out, launch again. The question that remained unanswered as the ceasefire clock ticked down and the diplomats prepared for another round was what would come next if the digging finished before the talking did.